Now. Got that going. Now today we're entering our third part of the seminar series. In our first seminar, we explored the historical roots that have shaped the African church and the realities faced today. We also reflected, thanks to Reverend Doug Slaughter from the Baptist Community Church in South Carolina. He reflected on the Black church in the US and the ways that in both contexts, communities have had to learn how to respond to the past in the present, to balance celebration and lament, and to reshape what the Christian faith and the church might look like through the lens of these experiences. 2 weeks ago, we had the privilege of hearing from Father Emmanuel Katongole from University of Notre Dame and our own Congo Initiative co-founder and president, Dr. David Kasali, who provided insight into where God might be leading the global church. Where can we catch glimpses of hope, even in the midst of brokenness? How might we think of the global church as a new community, a new we, as Father Katongole shared, that is born from lament and into movements and actions rooted in hope? Today, we turn our attention to what kind of leaders might be key to leading these communities of hope and transformation that make up the new we. And we explore what resources do these leaders need to faithfully pursue their calling. As many of you know, given our work and as you see our panelists today's expertise, you will see that we believe higher education, universities can play a significant role in this process. But the question becomes, why a university? What kind of university might play a role in forming a new generation of leaders? I have the honor to welcoming our panelists and our respondent for today's session. First of all, we'll hear from Dr. Paul Robinson, Congo Initiative co-founder. Professor Paul Robinson was born in the Belgian Congo, a son of missionaries. His passion, heart, and life have been shaped by a lifelong personal and professional engagement with Africa, focusing on a range of community development concerns, but particularly on higher education and the formation of young people for ethical and moral leadership in a rapidly changing global context. Paul earned a PhD in African history, has twice been a Fulbright scholar, and has taught in Africa and the US for more than 40 years at institutions that include Wheaton College, St. Lawrence University, UCBC, and most recently, Ugandan Christian University. We will then hear from our good friend, Dr. Honore Bunduki, the rector of UCBC. Dr. Honore Bunduki was born in a Christian family in Congo, where he earned degrees in English and applied pedagogy. After completing MA in Translation Studies and Theology at Nairobi Evangelical Graduate School of Theology, he served on the team that translated the Lendu Bible in Eastern DRC. Since the very beginning of UCBC, Honore served passionately as an English and theology teacher and as academic dean and then vice rector to the university, establishing and implementing UCBC's programs and structure. He earned his PhD in education science and philosophy from the University of South Africa and was appointed as the second rector of UCBC in 2018. Honore's vision is to establish UCBC as a university of excellence in the heart of Africa for the development and transformation of communities and for the thriving of global Christian higher education as a way of ushering in God's kingdom in all corners of the world. Honore is married to his wife, Deki, and they have 4 children and 2 adopted daughters who are the children of his late cousins. Honore is also an associate pastor at Seka 20 Francophone Church in Beni. Lastly, we'll get a chance to hear from our good friend, Dr. Rachel Sweet from the University of Notre Dame. She is an assistant professor of politics and global affairs at Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She has spent 5 years in East and Central Africa, where she has engaged with local universities, grassroots human rights organizations, and Congolese research networks. Rachel researches armed conflict and governance in areas affected by violence. Her work bridges academic study of conflict with practical applications, including mitigating the politicization of the Ebola outbreak and reducing harm of United Nations military intervention brigades in Northeast Congo. She holds a fellowship at Harvard University and has worked in an advisory role for the United Nations and government agencies to bridge community voices and perspectives to inform better policy. She lives in Chicago in a neighborhood with a large Congolese community and teaches about armed conflict and peace building in a multinational program at the Kroc Institute to master's and doctoral students from around the world. We are absolutely thrilled to have these panelists and respondents with us today. I think you will all just be very excited to hear from them. Each panelist will have about 20 minutes, and that will be followed by the 10-minute response to from Dr. Rachel Sweet. If you have questions, and please, we hope you do ask questions, you can use the chat room in Zoom to share your questions, and then we can read them out loud. If you struggle with that and you can find the raise the hand function of Zoom, you can also use that. We will make sure that we try to get as many questions as possible, but if we run out of time, we will respond via email next week. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and start our seminar, and I welcome Dr. Paul Robinson.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you everybody for being here on this Saturday. It's a really important topic that we're looking at today, is what is leadership and why UCBC? I've been doing a lot of reflecting on this over the last several years. And this isn't just a Congolese matter for me, it's actually a global issue. It seems like at every level, we're struggling with understanding what it means to lead, what it means to follow, what it means to participate. And why is leadership so important? I mean, in our own country today, we're in the middle of a process that is determining what a previous leader of this country was all about. And I think that, you know, in neighboring to Congo or Uganda, there's just been an election that was problematic. And leadership just is something that we're struggling with. We're struggling with a whole dimension of what is happening around leadership. How are leaders, what kind of leaders do we have? What kind of people are we? What kind of information do we listen to, et cetera? I want to preface my remarks this morning with just a couple of thoughts from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, his commentary on the book of Numbers, in which the Jewish people who had been held captive for 400 years in Egypt journeyed for 40 years towards freedom and nationhood. It wasn't an instant transformation from slavery to nationhood. It took over 40 years. The book is really an account how they were transformed from a company of slaves to a people with a purpose. And I think that's what we're about in Congo. If you look at the histories, the parallels are striking. 400 years in Congo of the beginning with the systematic enslavement of peoples on the western side of what was to become Congo, and then a history of 200, 300 years of that, and then colonialism, and then post-colonialism, and all of that, people enslaved, maybe not physically so much in the context, but enslaved in many other ways. With Jonathan Sacks, and so what I've been doing is I've been trying to go back to the roots of who we are as a people, what God has called his people to be. God, and this takes us back to our own roots in the Torah, in Judaism. And so I've been looking at Judaism, Jewish theology, to try to understand what it was that God was doing when he called out a people who were to be salt, light, and leaven to the nations around them. So Jonathan Sacks makes 5 notations about what it means to become, or to transform from a people who were enslaved to a people with a purpose, to a nation. The first thing he says is that a nation cannot be created simply by removing a tyrant, simply by escaping from tyranny. Freedom is not merely achieved by escaping. That's really important. Congo didn't become a nation simply by gaining independence from Belgium. Structural change requires human transformation brought about by rituals, habits of the hearts, and a strenuous process of education. The journey from captivity, secondly, requires that people become actors, not just passive players. I don't think the Congolese were ever passive in their own subjectivity, but they have to become active in the creation of freedom and society around them that reflects God's purposes. And thirdly, the road to freedom is longer and harder than can be achieved in one or even a few generations. The striking and beautiful thing for me was that in fact, it took a several generations, at least one generation, to transform the people from a rabble of ex-slaves to a nation. Generation rescued by Moses from oppression in Egypt had grown used to its chains. Think about that. We grow used to the situation that we are in. We don't have the ability to change unless we can acquire a different sort of set of values and mindset. The people, when they left Egypt, were not ready for the difficult freedom ahead of them. Fourthly, those who left Egypt had to become different kinds of people before they could enter and possess the land. They needed a whole period of 40 years. So the central theme of Numbers is of a passage or a journey that is less geographical, perhaps, than existential. They have to cast off the mindset of slavery and become free. And fifthly, the real journey to freedom is not a physical one. It is a mental, moral, and spiritual journey. Long, arduous, and demanding, and there are challenges and failures along the way. As it had been, people lacked the faith in themselves or in God to take the challenges in their stride. The road from slavery to freedom is as long or as short as it takes for people to develop the habits of responsibility for them and for their children's future. That's the background. It's a background to the transformation of the people, the children of Israel, into a nation of Israel. I've quoted this quite often, but Africa's one of most distinguished Nobel laureates was a woman from Kenya named Wangari Maathai. And she writes that just before her death in 2011, she writes in her book, "What has held Africa back and what continues to do so has its origins in a lack of principled ethical leadership. Leadership is an expression of a set of values. It's not just information, it's just knowledge, it's values. Its presence or lack of it determines the directions of a society and affects not only the actions, but the motivations and visions of the individuals and communities that make up society." She says Africa needs a revolution in leadership, a revolution that demands that its leaders not merely support honesty and transparency, but embody it in their behavior as well, fostering values such as fairness, justice, and working for the common good. She says, but perhaps the most important quality that African leadership needs to embrace, and which is desperately lacking across the continent, is a sense of service, a commitment to service. Now, if you know UCBC at all, you know that those are the three areas that form the triad, the foundation of a UCB education: values, knowledge, and commitment to service. So there's a growing conviction in Africa too, as I've spent time talking with visionary founders of universities such as Daystar University in Kenya and Uganda Christian University in Congo, and our own Dr. Kasali Uganda Christian University in Uganda, and our own Dr. Kasali, is that to develop such leaders requires education that is grounded in rigorous intellectual inquiry and equally anchored in character formation. And I look with dismay at our own country and of US and in the West, because in higher education here, we are moving away from those foundations as university education becomes more and more problematic in terms of its own sort of financial security and that kind of thing. And it becomes more expensive. The outcomes that are looked for are much more sort of vocational than they are formational. And so in a sense, the US is losing its own, and the West they're losing their own soul. The soul of the university has become training institutions rather than formative institutions. Universities have to be both. I wanted to say a few things about the differences between African traditional education and educational practices in European colonial education, because what's happened in Africa is that the education that was transferred by the colonial power colonial powers took the place of traditional African valued education. The African models were formative, developed to meet the needs of their own cult societies. Colonial governments, however, viewed their educational mandate as primarily the inculcation of practical skills to serve the needs of the colonial state, not the societies in which they were brought out of. With independence, now almost 60 years ago for many countries, the colonial model did not really change. And at present, many African nations and universities and colleges are wrestling with what kind of higher education to support and accredit. Overwhelmingly, present day higher education, education at all levels, is congruent with the colonial model. And so many are searching for a different model. I find it fascinating that it was as the West moves away from formative education, African leaders are saying we need to have formation as the anchor of our education because our leadership is wrong. I think we see the same thing happening in our own context. What I'm saying today is not just simply applicable to Congo. So UCBC was formed as part of a vision of its founders, Congolese men and women, educators, professionals, pastors, theologians, who back in the middle of Congo's civil war, its great war, right around the turn of this millennium, they asked themselves, what has gone wrong in our country? Where were we God's people in this, and what are we called to do about it? And one of the areas that they decided they had to really impact was a whole area of education, so that the mission, ethos, and practice of what would become Congo Initiative and its initiatives, including UCBC, were to model, nurture, and shape authentic, redemptive communities of Christ followers whose calling is to transform society. Community in which living and learning takes place in the context of togetherness and shared experience. But let me return to the question, why UCBC as a response to Congo's deep needs? Because it addresses the challenges, the crises that demand leadership, challenges of poverty, ignorance, priorities, greed, focus, resource extraction, and development that will together lead to the flourishing of environment and people. And why is this important to us as Christians? I think it's because God calls us to be people who are salt, light, and leaven in the societies around us. And he calls us to model and to model kingdom values, primarily and fundamentally the value of shalom, which is throughout the scriptures, being in right and just relationship with God, with God's creation, with one another, and with ourselves. Developing a new generation of leaders rooted in values and ethics, a change in mindset requiring a sense of value, self-worth, dignity, and capability. This is more than an African challenge. Again, it's a global challenge. I wanted to say, but I think I'm going to run out of time here. I want to talk about leadership in the colonial period and leadership in the pre-colonial period and what all that means. But I think I'm going to skip over that because I think that probably intuitively many of us understand that the colonial enterprise in Africa was not designed for the flourishing of African communities. It was really designed as an extractive as a society that would extract resources for our own sort of trade, benefit industries, and that kind of thing. And at independence, the system that had developed during the colonial period largely continued. We don't call it neo-colonialism after independence for nothing. So it was a continuing culture that really had the values of the outside, the other rest of the world at stake, rather than the formation of Africa as independent and countries, nations, continent to basically develop for their own societies. Colonialism was less about development and more about exploitation. In this kind of situation, people are trapped. They need to change the images. Colonialism eroded and undermined identities and traditional leaderships, removing constraints and accountability. Back to Professor Mathai. All of these questions, she argues, return to the question of leadership, which may be defined as the way a country establishes its priorities, holds its officials accountable for their actions, makes decisions, empowers its citizens to feel invested, engaged with their government, etc. The argument here is that it is a critical need for Africa to embrace the challenge of leadership, and that is heart and soul of what UCBC is all about. I think in this, a change of mindset also is necessary to allow people to understand that the current situation wasn't always so perilous, that the majority of their forebears were honest, fair, and just. Their societies were functional and people's basic needs were met. A challenge a challenge to change their understanding to understand that the kinds of situations they find themselves, impoverishment, or misdevelopment, poor leadership, are aspects of their identities which were forced upon them by external powers. And that change in mindset is absolutely critical to generating the kind of vision and understanding of a future that they need. So again, why UCBC? Many scholars, educators, and others argue that in each generation there is a developmental window from approximately the ages of 18 to 35 in which human capacities for compassion, community can be awakened. They're ages that correspond to the span of undergraduate and graduate education, professional schools such as medicine and law. Within this context, individuals' journeys through higher education, if made meaningful, holds critical turning points. A university then is not just a place for the transmission of knowledge, but a forum for the exploration of life's mystery and meaning and the formation of values, the way that people will live their lives. It's a critical time. Again, we could spend a day or more looking at all of this, but in every culture, young people who transition from childhood to adulthood, and societies very specifically educate their youth with information, values, meaning, and morality that are important to the success of the next generation. As far as those critical years I was just talking about, there are critical years in human development where basic beliefs about life, the world, are settled as one begins to live in the adult world. This developmental window is what we're looking at and what UCBC is committed to. Remember our meditation on the Book of Numbers. The real journey to freedom is not physical one, it's a mental, moral, and spiritual journey. The choices that young people make, the communities that they live with, their convictions, their character, and their community are all formed during the university years. I could cite a number of different sort of educators, psychologists, and others who can affirm that. But these are the years where one's convictions, which can constitute one's worldview, is shaped and formed. There's always a connection between worldview and a way of life. What one believes about the world will affect how one lives in the world. Character is formed during those years, and a community, young people tend to find others who share their convictions and who aspire to the same character, and they live out their lives in communities with like-minded people. It is Stephen Garber who's done more, I think, as a Christian philosopher who done more to kind of think through this than anyone I know, says it is those who develop a worldview, convictions that can address the challenges of coherence and truth in a pluralist society, who find a relationship with those who incarnate a world view, character, who choose to live their lives among others whose common life is an embodiment of that worldview, community, who will continue with purpose, integrity through their lives. That's what we're about. Forming and shaping young people who have convictions, who develop character, and who will form the kind of community that will be salt, light, and leaven in the world. Young people not only require the knowledge in those critical years, but also their convictions and character. So what are we doing in UCBC? Rabbi Sachs, again, let me come back to him as I conclude here. What UCBC does is it aspires to form leaders who are at their core women and men of freedom, of wisdom. He notes that we look for the wrong kind of leadership. We call for people with answers, decisions, strength, the map for the future, someone who knows where we ought to be going. In short, someone who can make hard problems simple. Instead, he argues, we should be calling for leadership that will challenge us to face the problems for which there are no simple, painless solutions, the problems that require us to learn new ways, making progress on the fundamental challenges that face all of us, including Congolese and including Americans. demands not just someone who provides answers from on high, but changes in our attitudes, behaviors, and values. We need a different kind of leader, a new social contract to promote our adaptive capacities rather than inappropriate expectations of authority. So what is it that we are looking for? First of all, and this is a summary of the book of this is actually a summary of the Jewish scriptures. When Rabbi Sachs looks at the entirety of the Jewish scriptures, he said, this is a kind of leadership that God was forming with these 7 characters. First of all, leadership is service. Moses was first and foremost a servant with a servant's heart and attitude. He is called a servant 18 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It's the highest accolade that was given to him, that he was a servant of the Lord and his people. Service requires humility. Humility is the highest virtue of a leader. We want to form leaders who are committed to service. Secondly, leadership begins by taking responsibility. When we see something wrong, we can complain or we can act. Complaining does not change the world, acting does. Everything up until Moses, people were blaming others. Think about it. Adam blamed Eve. Cain blamed Abel. On and on it goes, or blame going. Moses was the first one to take responsibility. Leading is about being active, not passive, choosing a direction, not simply following the person in front of us. Leaders act and they take responsibility, but more, they join with others. They share leadership. Moses shared leadership between Aaron and Miriam and others down through his life. They're not jealous of other people's leadership. They don't feel threatened by others. They empower and enable others. We want to develop leadership too, who take responsibility, who act to change their circumstances and the circumstances of their communities, and who will work together with others. Our catchphrase, our line, Tupo Pamoja, we are together. Thirdly, leadership is vision driven. Before Moses could lead, he had to experience a vision. He had to be given a vision at the burning bush. And there he was instructed in his task. And then secondly, he had a destination. The destination was the promised land. Leaders are led by vision and a vision of their future. They know where they're going, and this is what inspires others. So thirdly, we want to inspire leaders who become visionaries with a destination, the kingdom of God coming into being here on earth as is in heaven. Fourth, the highest form of leadership is teaching. Think about it, Deuteronomy. The entire book is a series of lectures that Moses gave within a month of his death. They taught the people of Israel to be a nation. They were values driven. The greatest moment in Moses' life came in his last month when, having led the people for 40 years, he assembled them on the bank of the Jordan and delivered the teachings that are the book of Deuteronomy. And at that point, he is called Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. Great leaders are teachers, teaching people to understand the meaning of their time and how to engage the meaning of their time. So we want to teach young people to become leaders who are lifelong learners and who will teach others, inspiring others to think and act and see in new ways. Fifth, a leader must have faith in the people that he or she leads. Moses at times struggled with believing in the people. Justifiably so, but God reprimanded him. One of the few times that God reprimanded Moses was that Moses said the people did not believe. God said to him, Moses, the people don't believe because you don't believe in them. So we want to teach young people through service learning and community engagement to ignite in emerging leaders a deep confidence in the communities of which they are part and whom they will serve. Our service learning program is based around this, around learning from communities. 2 more. 6, leaders need a sense of timing and pace. Throughout his life, Moses led, but he learned not to lead too far ahead of his people. His life was about learning to go at a pace that people could bear. He had to spend 40 years doing that. One of his deepest frustrations was the sheer time it takes for people to change. Over and over again, we read about this. It would take a whole new generation and actually a new leader to lead the people across the Jordan. So 6, we want to prepare leaders who are tenacious and working for change and at the same time cognizant of the time that is needed for transformation. Leadership requires a delicate balance between patience and impatience. And finally, everyone is summoned to the task. The Jewish nation was to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, a people in which all of its citizens would be called to leadership and responsibility for one another. So 7, we want to shape leaders who will summon others to the tasks of individual, community, and national transformation. A final quotation from one of my favorite educators, Quaker Parker Palmer. Values such as compassion, social justice, and the search for truth, which animate and give purpose to the lives of students, faculty, and staff, are honored and strengthened by an integrative education. What we are talking about is integrative education, bringing together body, soul, and mind, hand, soul, body, spirit, all of that. But to be truly integrative, an education must go beyond values curriculum to create a comprehensive learning environment that reflects a holistic vision of humanity, giving attention to self. Educate, form young people as whole people, and they will bring all of who they are to the demands of being human in private and public life. They present and the present and future well-being of humankind asks nothing less of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, so much for that. Just setting the stage for us and for laying out the purpose and the reasons for a focus on leadership in the context of Congo and elsewhere, but also the role a university can play and how critical of a time that is in young people's lives and young adults. And I just think you did a wonderful job really preparing the way for our next panelist, our good friend, Dr. Honoré Bunduki, the rector of UCBC in Congo. Please join us now.
Good morning, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be on this panel and in this seminar. And I want to thank also Paul for paving the way and in this presentation. And on my side, I will try to zoom in on the educational context in DRC, which has laid the foundation to see how to come up with UCBC and present the education at UCBC, as well as 2 case studies of a social impact in the community of such an education, as we strive to develop a new kind of leaders. Allow me to start with these words from Michelle Nunn. She says this in her book, Leading the Change. I have seen firsthand that ordinary people are capable of superhero-like accomplishments. And also,
it looks like he froze here. Give me 1 second. See if we can connect with him. As you know, technology can be very challenging these days, and in Congo, it can be particularly challenging. As Honoré tries to reconnect, please, if you do have questions, feel free to type them in the chat section, and we will try to respond to them at that time, or during the Q&A. Sorry. Hey, Honoré, we just lost you for a moment.
Sorry, yeah, I
No
had
problem. You were going to share about Michelle Nunn. No worries.
I said that Michelle Nunn is talking about iconic figures in the world: Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Mother Teresa, all ordinary people, but people who are a new kind of leaders. And you become a new kind of leader, not necessarily through upholding elected offices or running corporations or making millions, but simply through longing to achieve transformation in your own life and in others' lives through giving them the way to, through giving yourself away to them and serving them to reveal their own potentials. And this is what these iconic figures have done. And let me suggest, before I zoom in on the context in the DRC and to see the kind of leaders that DRC needs and the world needs today in order to bring a new kind of society in DRC and in the world. I want to suggest this or to frame this kind of new leaders through a metaphor to describe the new kind of leaders using the thermostat and the thermometer. A thermostat, we know that it is a medical tool that serves to take temperature in the environment on human body. But we also know that the thermometer is a medical tool, takes temperature, but thermostat is another tool that is on a machine or on an electrical or technical machine to regulate the heat level for various purposes. Why do we say that? We are suggesting that we should better have thermostat type leaders as new kind of leaders rather than only thermometer leaders. We will see that later on as we move on. But let me give an overall review of the higher education practices in DRC. First, taking readings from three educators, particularly starting with the Professor Sial, who has written a book after investigating the educational context in the DRC, and what he presents sets the pace or paves the way for justifying why institutions such as UCBC should exist in the DRC. The book is entitled Former pour transformer, forming in order to transform. And in this book, he finds that DRC has so many years, higher education in DRC has so many years of existence, and it has trained so many graduates. Just for the window of 1971 to 1981, 35,000 graduates were trained. But then he comes with this question: why are the multitude of graduates not able to positively influence the country towards development? Sial, Matangila, and Kasongo, three researchers, suggest a simple answer: educational system failure. And secondly, which goes with this problem, an issue of moral behavior with graduates. Now, concerning the educational system, this is what they say: the system does not allow young
Bear with us again. Try to get them reconnected here in a moment. As we wait for Honoré, I did just want to draw your attention to Paul Robinson provided some of the resources he used in his discussion, in his sharing. So those are located in the chat. You'll see a number of books he mentions there.
Again, I'm so sorry. I
No
don't
problem.
know what's wrong with the connection today, but
It's okay.
Baking type education, where the teacher is at the center of the educational endeavor, and he has the monopoly of knowledge, no room for contribution or contradiction from students. Students have to give back the deposit of knowledge that they got from the teacher on assessment. And this is debilitating for students. And also the education system is theory oriented in total disconnection with daily life realities. And because of that, memorization becomes the rule and assessment targets winning more grades, but not developing knowledge nor character. And it is easy for the facilitator or teacher to craft tests to push learners to depend on himself or herself. And this is what promotes corruption, because at the end of the day, people want to pass the class and people want to have grades. And so they can be ready to give anything. Education is not preparing them for judgment and character formation. And so that is concerning the failure of educational system. The second aspect, graduates' moral behavior problem, which does not allow to induce necessary change in the society. And they mentioned a few of these problems that they found in the Congolese context: lack of punctuality, lack of sense of self-organization, lack of commitment to service, lack of initiative, lack of dependability and availability to serve, and prevailing lack of honesty and service-oriented mindset. This is a very dark portrait. Then so what? What should we say? One main solution that Cial suggests is operate a deep educational reform in the DRC, a reform that would have three different elements. It would be learner-centered, it would incorporate integrated learning, and then it would make development and social impact become the focus of education. In 2009, because this investigation was done in 2007 by Cial and his colleagues, in 2009, the government in the DRC launched the LMD reform. And that reform particularly is learner-centered, removing the teacher from his throne and bringing the students at the center of the educational action. And also it is focused on the promotion of research as a way to impact communities and trigger development. So impact into community becomes a question, a reality. Then the key question is what kind of education that will allow to have a new kind of leaders for a new kind of a DRC society. I want to suggest education that trains not only thermometer-like, but mainly thermostat-like leaders, as I said. Thermometer-like leaders, they have proven knowledge, but mainly focused towards acerb criticism. Not because they are prone toward criticism, but the educational context in which they grew have framed them in a way that acerb criticism becomes the way. And also thermometer-like leaders, they have no or little suggestion of solution or partaking in solution-giving processes. The thermometer is good to take the temperature, but it will not heal a sick person or take any action towards that process. And also this is such a thermometer-like leaders are a result of a teacher-centered education system that develops orientation towards complaints and negative criticism through stifling the spirit sense of judgment, stifling critical thinking, stifling the potential in students. And so they are pushed to develop complaints in all situations. And once they are promoted to a position, complaint continues to be the system. Now I'm the master, and now you have to look up to me. And so such thermometer-like leaders is the result of the fact ideas and thoughts, and they did not build self-esteem, did not build confidence in them to present their thoughts. But thermostat-like leaders, a thermostat regulates heat. They have proven knowledge as well, but knowledge that serves to regulate change around them. And they, just like the thermostat, partake in any action that is undertaken to bring solution to problems. They are the result of a learner-centered educational system. They will never imagine not being part of the solution in the context where they are placed. They are simply champions of the change they want to see in the community. They are free. They talk less, but they act more. A thermostat will just regulate everything. CIU-CBC is committed to train thermostat-like leaders, which requires a radical shift in the perception of higher education, both on the side of teachers and of learners. And this again, I want to borrow from Stephen Garber, as Paul mentioned. He says that higher education dares not become merely the avenue to success. It must be the gateway for responsibility. It should not be concerned with competence alone, but with commitment to civic responsibility. An academic degree should not be a hunting license only for self-advancement, but an indication of abilities to seek, cultivate, and sustain a richer common well-being. It is not enough to achieve cultural literacy. We must engender social concern. It is not enough merely to open the mind. It is necessary to cultivate moral intentionality in a total selfhood. So let's take the case of CIU-CBC as an approach to a new educational approach for impact in community. It is built on a holistic formation that is oriented towards affecting positively change in the community. But what are the foundations of this education? One, renewal of the mind. The mindset inherited from the colonial past, as Paul described, but also inherited from the cultural background, needs to be sifted through the renewal of mind based on values that come out of being open to speak up, to develop, or to let one's potential flourish. Secondly, softening of the hearts. And thirdly, training of hands to express generosity, creation care, and identification with the community. It is these three things that CIU-CBC has adopted as the triadic training foundation, where we have academic inquiry, as Paul said, service learning, and work program combined to train the new kind of leaders. Academic inquiry develops students' capacities in areas of expertise with the faith and learning integration context based on the postulate that all truth is God's truth in physics, in mathematics, in philosophy, social, whatever, all truth belongs to God. And so we are just stewards of the truths of God. And service learning forms character in students and love for service. It moves them from classroom into community. And what are the steps through which this happens? First, there is a course that is given to students, and the course leads them to identify problems in the community, and then together they suggest practical solutions, and then they implement the solution in the community with the community. Three advantages that it brings: increase the retention of course content because it has been very practical as opposed to theory-oriented approach that we saw before. And second advantage, service to community. And third advantage, setting a model for community members through identification with them in seeking solution to practical problems of the life. So education is not something that is abstract, it is something practical demonstrated in the community. And through work program, students are taught to rub sleeves as stewards of the God-given environment, to clean. And this contributes to the development of work ethic, a sense of civic responsibility, as Garber mentions, and a sense of care for creation and role modeling for the change in the community. Now, let's take two case studies from the example of CI-UCBC. And these case studies will be framed through 4 elements. First, the problem. Second, assets to bring solution to the problem. Third, the solution that was suggested. And fourth, impact in the community. First case is Kivu Green Energy, today Nuru, which came out of a service learning experience at UCBC. What was the problem? Lack of energy in the community, which made it difficult to create industries, to run organizations and factories, and have light in families for children to study and have good results at school. Problem of creation care from charcoal makers who were destroying the environment, a complex issue, but there was an asset, good sunny days that God graciously gives. And so the solution, develop an environment-friendly energy production system to serve the population. Kivu Green Energy started by building a small-scale solar grid in Beni, which brought energy at low cost and quality energy with quality service. And secondly, second solution is the extension of the experience to Goma with a medium-scale solar grid in Goma. Ndosho quarter, which was one of the quarters in Goma in darkness completely, is now with light. And insecurity rate has been lowered. And also there is development of energy-supported businesses, large refrigerators to keep perishable food, saloons, and so on. So development being promoted, jobs being created at grassroots level. So impact in the community, creation of employment for the youth. Majority of the staff, let me note this, at Nuru now, Kivu Green Energy, are UCBC alumni serving with integrity and commitment as a result of the education, thermostat-like education they received at UCBC. Second, impact, government receiving its share of taxes with integrity. And thirdly, young people inspired to emulate the model of Kivu Green Energy and Nuru, and they are considering to replicate the model throughout the country. Started in a course, but today expanding in the community, in the country. Second example, sharing the land with the digital and participatory mapping project. Here also the problem was land conflict. Through a course, it was found that at Justice Court, over 70% of cases were related to conflict, land conflict, between individuals, between families, but also between entities, political administrative entities, the town and the county and the local chiefs. Asset, knowledge of land information systems and also geographic information systems. Solution, develop a project focusing on digital mapping through participatory approach. And so this brought training of land administration staff in terms of land information system, GIS, and knowledge on risk mitigation through upholding integrity values. Allow me to say here that before this project came, there was a complete misunderstanding or no confidence in land administration people because they were said to be corrupt. But with the project, this mitigation of risk has taught them to be prone towards integrity. And so pilot projects were run in Beni as well as in Goma. Impact in community. Conflicts were resolved and prevented at several levels, between individuals, between families, and between entities. And also between entities, the latest case is with the town of Mangina, of which the limits were not known. But thanks to the project, there is clarification and digital mapping of Mangina town limits. There is no more conflict between the territory and the town and the local chiefs. And also another impact is that there is this clarification of who belongs where when it comes to elections. In the past, population in Mangina, some would be counted as in Mangina, others under the responsibility of the local chiefs, and a permanent conflict that can clash into serious situations. And also the clarification of the Beni town limits is in process, still as part of the project, and there is revenue developed for the government because of a possibility to track and raise taxes on properties for provincial government. And this fuels the operations of land administration services, and which has brought another element, which is a change of mentality noted within the land administration, because land administration personnel, through the taxes that are raised, now their offices can operate. And also they were able to continue
Okay, I think he froze up.
digital mapping even after the project ended. In Beni, the Matom broke out. He says, now a new generation is taking their place, a generation of young people empowered with the tools of transformational technology, personal computers, the internet, cell phones, and satellites. But the best of them know there is no delete button for poverty, no insert button for morality, no cut and paste for tolerance. They know from the lessons left behind by their parents and grandparents that life is most rewarding when the boots are on the ground and hands are extended to care for others. For long, the educational system in the DRC would not allow for boots to be on the ground, hands to be extended to care, because of this clash between the master, who was the teacher, and the learners. Now, turning the thing upside down changes the dynamic. And for that, as Brockhaus suggests, we need to read the context. We are in the age of transformational technology. We need to see how to bring it on board as we train a new kind of leaders. In DRC, globally, technology is there. Secondly, we need to account for aspects that cannot occur by magic or the pushing of a simple button. That is character formation. It will not come by a button. Institutions, schools, and the church need to be intentional in planning character formation, and also intentionality in implementing holistic, integrated approach to the training of the new kind of leaders. And these kind of leaders will become, in the words of Dr. Habecker in his book, Rediscovering the Soul of Leadership, they become leader followers because they lend an ear to their constituencies and learn from them. Also, they identify with their constituencies through keeping their boots on the ground and their hands extended to care for others. As they identify with the constituencies, it is the incarnation of theology now brought in the realm of education, because they incarnate with the social context in which they are called to operate. If that incarnation does not happen, then salvation would not have happened. Because should Jesus not have come to save, to identify with the poor and the weak, we would be lost. But because of that, today there is hope. And also, should students not identify with the people in the community, there is no way that graduates will positively influence development in their communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Honore. We really appreciated you bringing it, zooming in on the context of Congo, and particularly the training and the ethos and the philosophy at UCBC. I was inspired again hearing the stories of impact and the examples of impact you've given through alumni at UCBC, but also what it looks like to bring about transformation within the education, within higher education in Congo, and to be a leader in that is so inspiring for us. I'm happy to, we're running a few minutes behind schedule, but definitely still want to give the 10 minutes to Dr. Rachel Sweet to respond. And then we'll, if folks are okay with extending this maybe 5 more minutes, I would like to leave time for Q&A at the end. So again, feel free to ask questions in the chat room, but I would like to welcome Dr. Rachel Sweet now.
Thank you, Justin. It's a real honor to be invited to share reflections from the US context and thinking about how to translate some of Paul and Honore's reflections. By way of background, Paul was a mentor to me, an undergraduate, and 12 years ago, when I went to Congo the first time, is when I met Honore. Then I did my graduate school, doctorate, and postdoc in Congo as well. And this means that from these years of 18 to 35, I was intimately crafted and shaped by Congolese teachers. And now in my work as a professor at Notre Dame, and also with UN missions, investigative teams, and international tribunals, I see that on a global scale and on the US side, one of our perpetual failings is the continued difficulty of understanding who our teachers are, and a failure on the global scale of listening to the voices who should be telling the story. So in reflecting on Honore and Paul's discussions, I want to invite you into a more expansive imagination from the US context about how to consider who our own teachers and educators are. And I'll do this through sharing a little bit about my personal experience in Congo, as well as here in the US, and then thinking about integrating the two. Paul and Honore invite us into the question of who are our teachers and who are we listening to? They highlight the tragedy that new generations of leaders oftentimes take up the tools of domination. The contradictions in Congo are that after generations of education, thousands of students going through university systems, and yet many of the structural injustices remain the same. And they invite us into a lament for the failure to develop principled leadership, and also the reminder that education can balance precipitously in the service of old systems of domination. In Congo, these systems of domination look like militaries that intimidate civilian populations, traditional chiefs who do not or cannot intervene when armed groups displace everyday people from their land. The dominations also look like government representatives who look out at seas of white tents and camps of displaced people and who do not take action. Leaders that criticize harshly, but who do not engage in the work of transformation. Rabbi Sachs and Paul's reflections remind us that history is littered with examples of oppressed people who later become oppressors. It is, in a sense, the most human thing to do. And it's also in this context that universities have an important role to play. Because education is not just about knowledge acquisition. It's not just about accumulating facts. It's about developing a character that does not shy away from the knowledge of the realities that surround us. Universities equip us for the task of being clear-eyed and looking at these systems of injustice. And that the pursuit of knowledge is also intertwined with cultivating the character and the ability to looking at these systems head on. I want to share this briefly through 2 teachers of mine in Congo, who I met over 2 different meals in Butembo, which is a city not too far from Beni. One of these meals was with a person who I'll call Kakule. Kakule is an elite in Butembo, one of the main economic actors in the town, a millionaire in his own right. He welcomed me into his home, treated me to a piano concert himself on a piano he had imported from the US. On his walls were pictures of him and his children on their travels to Dubai and Jakarta. I had come to interview him about the reality of war economies. And over the course of an enormous spread of chicken and potatoes and rice laid out, he told me the stories that challenged my own conceptions of who the elite are and how we're able to navigate some of these international economies. And he looked at me as I looked at his pictures and he said, "Do you see me? Do you see me?" And his picture of looking out over an ocean in Dubai. From there, I went to another meal with a friend who I'll call Jean. Jean is an active member of an armed group. I met him in a demobilization camp, but as he explained to me, the demobilization camp was just an opportunity for his militia to rest a while and to recover before defecting again and joining and rejoining their group in the jungle. We shared a common plate of rice and beans, Jean and 8 of his companions and myself. We talked about involvement in killings around the area. And as I left to walk away, he told me to sit back down. And he said, "Do you see me?" He told me to sit back down and told me one by one of 9 different massacres that he had experienced himself in his village growing up, and the family members of his who had been killed. And that in a previous life, he had been a doctor, but saw no other way at this point but to take up violence in order to protect his community. The irony here is also that Jean's group, I later figure out, was sponsored by one of Kekule's economic partnerships and also with the local church in town. And it's these conversations and teachers that inverted for me how I saw the world and reality, where people who are killers also come with their own stories of victimhood as well. And that we have these contradictions of who is elite and who is the learner, and support by the local churches in this whole process. In these processes, clearly I am the learner and I am being put in my place, being made to sit back down and listen better. Congo Initiative in UCBC is a unique place that assembles students from across all of these backgrounds. It means that we need to listen closely to the realities that people face, and that pretending that these contradictions aren't there simply won't work. But rather, education in this context, like in the DRC Realities class, is about seeking out these other perspectives and the paradox of holding people and structures in tandem, to listen to soldiers who participate in violence because they understand it to be their only way of escaping cycles of intimidation themselves, and to develop also a new story about us. It's in these contexts that we need to be clear-eyed and also intimately engaged with the context of community. For us, in the context of the United States and the global church, we also have our own set of demands as well. For ourselves, thinking about how to be partners to CIUCBC, we are also called into a process of self-transformation that is not only internal, but that needs to be worked out through the communities and societies and contexts where we are also embedded. It also requires us to participate in our own work of looking clearly at ourselves and our own contexts. Here in the US, I teach a class for undergraduates called Identity, Power, and Politics. The start of the class is not unlike Paul's reflection that begins with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's writings on the Book of Numbers. In Numbers, a Jewish people who had been in captivity for 400 years journeyed toward freedom and became a new people with a purpose. In our US context, we certainly also have legacies of slavery. These legacies are filled with uneven housing policies, with Jim Crow laws, with realities of Black migrants to northern cities like my own in Chicago and Detroit, having their houses burned down. One of our temptations, and one of my temptations as someone who is white in these areas, is to want to place those realities on others. Yet as we grapple with our own societal realities, we also need to grapple with our own self-narratives. I have a self-narrative of being a descendant of poor Norwegian farmers. My great-great-grandpa came to the US. He wasn't rich. He only had a suitcase as he got off the boat. We weren't well off. We settled in a poor place in north central Wisconsin. We were not slave owners. It's easy for us to say, and my family, that we are not implicated in these systems. This summer, when I returned to that poor area in north central Wisconsin to search for my mother's grave, I was also reflecting on more of the places that our family came from. And as I began to dig into my own family's legacy and lineage, I also was able to trace it back to very clear ways that my own family and my own body and blood and bones intersect with the legacies of slavery. I learned that one of my great-grandfathers was a pastor in the Confederate South who was raising armies to fight for that side of the army. I learned about family members of mine who used to be part of alternative religious communities in Pennsylvania and who abandoned those in order to move toward the promise of a richer South where they could participate in structures of being white elites in those areas. This also means that I carried contradictions in my own body. Through my own research, I learned that there's likely a whole other side of my family who looks very different from myself and has Black skin, but we share common ancestors as well because of legacies of rape in the slavery period. This means that we need a bigger story and a new story that can hold these contradictions. If this is my story, it is likely your story as well, and the story of your neighbors or your children or your grandchildren. We need a common story of lament that also invites us into a critical and clear-eyed self-reflection that is able to engage with lament, and that also understands the humanness of some of the structural and violent decisions that are made, and that enable us to go beyond rigid expectations of being perfect or above it all in order to settle into the contradictions, and for us to learn how to be comfortable with our own discomfort. On the global scale, we in the US also face the reality of how to engage in a place like Congo. And certainly, as Wangari Maathai brings up, part of the tragedy is that in our own context in the global north, we have often looked at Africans as people not able to speak on their own behalf. Paul writes that people need to collectively understand that the current situation wasn't always so perilous, that the majority of forebears in Africa were honest, fair, and just, and their societies were functional and people's basic needs were met. We need stories in our role as partners with UCBC that also acknowledge the role of the global church in some of these contradictions. We need a new story, and this is the role of education. And our tasks as partners to a university in this place involve one of individual and global awakening and of participation in compassionate communities. This is what education can offer. It offers the invitation to hard work as critical thinking capacity in Honoré's eyes, with a clear knowledge of what the dominant structures are and the internal change processes and convictions to not perpetrate them. And that moving away from education as a context of just knowledge transfer into a place where teaching goes beyond university walls and invites new perspectives and ways of being. I'll just close with 3 points from Paul's own conclusion, that in the university and in UCBC, we're invited into an expanded capacity to be fully present to others in ways that affirm and heal. We're invited into increased skill and asking the honest, open questions that help others uncover their own inner wisdom. And we're invited into the courage to live and lead more authentically. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, so much for sharing that and for your response. What an amazing way that you've revealed the complexity of being human and the contradictions that we have to face and confront and name and be open and honest about. Even as members of the global church, as our local church communities here in the US and in Congo, as we all know, it is complex and it can be very difficult to find our way through it all and to create a new story. But I really appreciate the way you've named that, the way you've reflected on that, both personally and given your experience in Congo. I mean, I think that is something, as somebody who has also lived in Congo and has spent time there, you know, some of those things aren't revealed to me even while being there. You don't realize the complexity even after living there. And I just really appreciate the way you've named that. I think often when we hear about things like the killings in Congo, when we hear about some of the things that happen in our own context, it is very easy for us to, lack of a better word, demonize, to think of folks as being inherently, whether it's inherently evil or inherently, you know, troubled or this or that, and not realize that they have their own story, their own reasons for participating in these things that are deeply, deeply hard to fathom if you haven't experienced them. So I just really appreciate you sharing with us today. I welcome again anybody to ask any questions. I'd like to give us, we are a little bit over time, but I would like to at least give us maybe until, okay, so I'm 9:20 here out west, so 9:30 my time, which I think is 12:30 out there in the East Coast, and 11:30 in Central Time. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead and either you can unmute yourself or submit any. Paul wants to recommend here, I'm reading that folks check out Emmanuel Katongle's book, Mirror to the Church, which is another great way of reading about and reflecting on something, you know, the Rwanda genocide and what happened there, and sort of the humanizing it and reflecting on what that means for us as a global church to think about ourselves.
Justin, can I interject here?
Absolutely, go ahead.
It's actually more than that. It is a reflection on Rwanda, and it's a mirror to ourselves. I mean, as we have looked at what Rachel has described for the US, as we've looked at what we've described for Congo, as we've described for others, it's important to see these stories as to seek out these perspectives, but also to seek them out for not only for their own understanding, but also how they speak to ours, because we can't see ourselves until we've seen ourselves through others' lenses. And Emmanuel's book is profound given our own situation at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. You know, I'd like to, for our panelists or Rachel, I would like to sort of ask this question. I think one of the things I hear often from people, sometimes our supporters, sometimes my friends, my own community, and coming from speaking from a Christian perspective, is it is really hard sometimes to think then how to write this new story and how to participate in this new story. Being honest about the past, not just the colonial realities that have shaped some of the ways the West has engaged with the continent of Africa, but more specifically, we can think about sub-Saharan Africa and Congo. It is sometimes hard for even myself to say, well, what then can we do? What should we do? I would love to hear from you guys more specifically about how we might respond from an American perspective, from folks living in the US. Obviously, supporting the work of Congo Initiative is one way to think about that. But really, what sort of philosophy should we start thinking about? How can we reimagine our engagement with the communities in places like Eastern Congo? What might that look like for us to become more involved, but involved in a way that is different from the past, that might challenge the contradictions that Rachel so eloquently shared with us. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, Justin, just briefly, the thing that jumped out for me is what Rachel said, that we have to, we need to enter into each other's wisdom. There is this sense of, we just, as Americans, we think we have all the answers. We're not community oriented. We don't know how to just be with each other. This is something that Dr. Casali has taught, as some of us have gone to Benny. That's his instructions when we step off the bus, you know, just be with us. And your respect, it just grows. And it's that kind of journey that helps us become learners, you know, again. So.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond back to that, I think even as I think about our own context here in the US, and as probably a lot of us have sort of experienced in the last few years, is I would say we're not always the best listeners, and we do not often take that place of learning. And I think that's great wisdom, Bill, that you sort of share here, of how, not just how we engage in Congo and our work there or the communities there, but also even our own context.
Hi, this is Linda Van Hook from Durham, North Carolina.
Hi, Linda.
Forgive me for not showing my face. I got on mud.
It's okay.
But anyway, I did want to take this opportunity to reflect on, a gentleman mentioned Rwanda. I had the opportunity to live in Rwanda on a 7-year human resource health initiative back in 2012, 2015, 16, 17. And I truly agree, and I really regret that we were a group of 100 healthcare professionals that was sent there to help Rwanda rebuild their healthcare system. Unfortunately, and I truly regret this, is that none of us was prepared to be listeners. We went there with a colonial educational model that we knew it all, and we knew what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it. And of course, much of our work was rejected. And now I hear, after the end of the initiative, that they have reverted back to much of what they were doing before we got there. And and it was a very expensive initiative that was government and other organizations sponsored. But I only say that to say that if we wanted to maybe implement, we have a lot of Americans that go to other countries with the idea that we're going to help, and we end up trying to be the know-it-all and telling someone how to do what they are supposed to do. So my suggestion is that I don't know how we can do this within this within this country to prepare others when they're venturing into other countries in Africa or elsewhere, because we also do this in Haiti, that we don't go without first listening to who they are and how they do what they do and walk alongside with them. I think that needs to be taught to people before they go into other countries. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Linda.
I'm not sure. Hi, everyone. I am a sorry, I'm stuck with how to introduce myself. I'm not part of this group, but I am a visitor, a guest of Muhia. He's my professor. I am studying the university that he's teaching. The program is called outdoor and adventure leadership. I asked Muhia if I could share some of my experience studying in the higher education context as a foreign student. It involves cross-cultural communication. I hear someone was talking about listening. I think that's something that I feel deeply related to. I think communication has a value of like communication help people to get to know each other, asking questions, knowing the other person. The more you know another person, the more you could serve the other person well. I'm not indicating or implying that people here didn't serve me well as a foreign student, but in some ways I feel I am kind of not seen. I was not seen in some certain context because mostly people don't know me that well. They don't know my culture. They don't know my experience, and the conversations I have had in the past 2 years are very friendly, but also very formal. So in the formal, friendly conversations, like we're just checking. It's a social ritual conversation. It's not a conversation for you to disclose who you are, to share more meaningful conversation with others. So, so I felt in some ways I wasn't known by my community. They didn't really know me well to serve me well. So what I've been thinking is, I think for a lot of higher education, serving the marginal society, marginal people could be a way to improve higher education quality. That's what I'm thinking and pondering on. Because in Bible, God teach us to search for the one that's lost, that's that has been gone away. So I have been searching, like, should I ask my institution to serve me? Do I deserve the service? Do I have the position to ask them to serve me well? But I haven't been thinking about that. I think it has a value for the institution to think about serving the people who are not a majority, who are on the marginal side. And also maybe it took a lot of work. It's challenging. It makes you feel uncomfortable. And not only just socially, maybe even economically. It feels like you're gonna invest a lot for the small group of people. Do you want to invest in that in a small group of people who you probably don't even like? You don't even know you want to invite them into your house. So I think this is something I have been experiencing and pondering on. Thank you. So I want to share. Thank you for the opportunity. I think you guys are doing a great job.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate it. This might be a great way just quickly to mention that in a couple weeks, we will have Muhia, Assistant Professor of Outdoor and Adventure Leadership Program at Wheaton, joining us as a panelist, along with Charlie Brainerd, the Dean of International Programs at Taylor University, and a response from Chelsea Chan, our Congo Initiative USA Board Chair. But I'd love to keep this open for conversation, and your comments actually make me sort of reflect on UCBC and what I know of the community and the organization there. One of the things that I think, and Honore, you can sort of add here, one of the things I know that is important for the community there is to see one another, is to see each student. And particularly, one of the things that is very transformative in terms of looking at the way education in Congo has been, is there hasn't always been the sort of ability to have those kind of conversations even with your teachers. And I mean, even seeing here, a student joining a teacher in this call and having this conversation and being a part of it is critical. And something that we love to see at UCBC is the fact that one of the things I hear from alumni and students often is they never thought they could sort of have the conversations that they can have with the leadership of the university, with their teachers, in a safe space, to be able to think critically with them, to ask questions. I think one of the things, even from my own education experience, has always been the freedom and space to ask really good questions, so we can think clear-eyed, so we can learn from one another. And Honore, you might want to speak to this, just how unique it is that there are those kind of relationships at a university in Congo, at UCBC.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I think that you are totally right. Myself, I studied in a public university where I never met the chancellor or the rector of the university. Only on graduation day, that's the day that you shake hands. Apart from that, you see him from afar, and that's it. But then that does not allow to come to know one another better, and also to support one another better. And that's why at UCBC, the approach is the other way around. How do we are human beings, we have to value oneself, and we have to do things together with students and so on. But beyond that, it is important to cultivate the capacity to be with. And that's what I'm hearing even from what our sister there with the Professor Muhia said. Being with, that takes you a step further to go a bit deeper. And as Rachel said, to get into the wisdom of one another, and then start allowing the other one to also release the potential that is in them. When that opportunity is given, then you notice growth, self-confidence, self-esteem, and then opening up, and all the potentials can serve the community. And that's what we are experiencing with our students, and they testify to it, because they often ask, is this really the president? Is this the rector? Is this, how come that we can just interact like that? To the point that visiting faculty who come from other institutions tend to say, no, your students are not polite. It is not that they are not polite. It is that they speak with confidence. They speak their hearts. They bring their ideas and thoughts. And that is something that needs to be developed. And the system in the country would not give a space for that to happen. So developing the capacity to be with, and that happens also through many other activities beside the academic inquiry. For instance, the mentoring program, where you can have students who open up in a small group with the faculty, with staff, and all of this triggers this opening up and being able to speak confidently, but also to reflect on various issues, sharing thoughts and ideas.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to again just thank everyone for joining us this morning. It was incredibly fruitful for me personally, and to hear each of these panelists share and reflect on what it might look like to develop a new generation of leaders, what a university, how a university can be involved in that process. And I really hope you all enjoyed it as well. We welcome you to join us in a couple weeks on February 27th for our last seminar, as I had mentioned. We are looking forward to closing out this series. We will also, a few people have asked for, I believe, presenter notes, and we will try to get a hold of those and send those out to those who have RSVP'd or who have joined us for these calls. But we will also have the recordings of these calls available shortly. And so you will have a chance if you want to review or watch again, or please share with others. We really, this is how we imagine CI as a global community, sharing experiences, learning from one another, listening to one another. And so we welcome you to share this with others as well. A special thanks to Dr. Paul Robinson, Dr. Honore Bunduki, and Dr. Rachel Sweet for joining us this morning, this evening in Congo, and being a part of these seminars. We are so grateful for your insights, for your reflection, for your wisdom and thoughtfulness today. So thank you so much. We do have Dr. David Casali on our call, who I have asked if David, if you would go ahead and close us out with a word of prayer, we would deeply appreciate that. If anybody else has questions, please feel free to go ahead and email myself or my colleague Shelly. You can, I'll shoot our emails here in the chat room real quick. But feel free to if you have any other questions you have, to go ahead and submit those to us. So thank you, David. David, you're on mute. You're on mute. Sorry, we got to hear the prayer. Thank you.
I wanted to say thank you again for joining us in these sessions. Before I pray, I say thank you. When we started Congo Initiative, our mind was in Congo and Congo, how we can raise up a new generation of leaders to change this country. But later on, we realized that it's not just about Congo. It's about a global communication and global listening to each other. And thank you again, Linda, for your comments and how you in America can join us here. I wrote here a few steps here. Yes, so you need to listen. I think now Africans have started listening, speaking. So it's better that you also learn to listen and to ask questions and to learn to identify and to be involved in one way or another. God is forming that global community that we are. Father, this is our prayer, that you will continue to form us into a global community, but teach us to listen to one another, teach us to identify with our context and raise up leaders who will lead us to that. In America and Congo, we do trust and believe that new stories are being written. And we want to be bold and courageous to face these new stories and rewrite the stories in a new way. Thank you for these sessions, and continue with us in the next session in 2 weeks. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning again. And we hope to see a lot of you in a couple weeks. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.